we're here ready to go over our Defeating Darwinism. We're going to read chapter 2 today, which is called Inherit the Wind. The play's the thing. And if you haven't heard before, Inherit the Wind is an old-timey movie. It might be a fun one for you to get and watch. It'll certainly help you better understand what this chapter is trying to teach you. This chapter is going to go over what do outsiders see when they look at Christians. That's kind of the purpose here is, what do they see? How do we look like to them? And as we've discussed in like debate first semester, understanding somebody else's point of view is half the battle in figuring out how to communicate with them. So by watching Inherit the Wind, talking over here, we can see how other people view Christians in this evolution versus creationism battle. And that gives you a better ability to talk and communicate with them and to understand where they're coming from and know how to speak to them clearly and to the points that are important to them. So that's kind of what this chapter is going to get into, and it's going to touch on what do we want to do now that we understand how other people view us, how can we talk to them, and how does this play out in the real world, okay? And if we haven't met before, hi, my name's Erica Lynn, and I help homeschooling become easy for you too. So I hope these Let's Do Homework Together sessions are beneficial and helps you make it through your homework without struggling. All right, we're gonna dive right into chapter 2. After almost every lecture I give, some person, usually a parent, asks me for advice about how to come across as a reasonable person when speaking up at a school board meeting against the dogma teaching of Darwinian evolution. People who only want unbiased, honest science education that sticks to the evidence are bewildered by the reception they get when they try to make their case. Their specific points are brushed aside, and they are dismissed out of hand as religious fanatics. The newspapers report that creationists are once again trying to censor science education because it offends their religious beliefs. Why is it so hard for reasoned criticism of biased thinking to get a hearing? Another way to put this is, how do you get people to listen to you and actually have a discussion instead of just being defensive? And I would highlight that question in green in your book because that is what we're going to answer in chapter 2. That's kind of the main question of this chapter. The answer to that question begins with a Jerome Lawrence and Robert E. Lee play called Inherit the Wind, which was made into a movie in 1960 starring Spencer Tracy, Gene Kelly, and Frederick March. You can rent the movie at any video store in a classics section, and I urge you to do so and watch it carefully after reading this chapter. The play is a fictionalized treatment of the Scopes trial of 1925, the legendary courtroom confrontation in Tennessee over the teaching of evolution. So to clarify here, the Scopes trial is an actual trial that took place. Inherit the Wind is the theatrical movie rendition of that, which is not all true to the facts of the original trial. However, Inherit the Wind captures very well how the world perceives Christians, so it's an even better representation than the facts of the Scopes trial on how people view Christians and creationists. Inherit the Wind is a masterpiece of propaganda, promising a stereotype of the public debate about creation and evolution that gives all virtue and intelligence to the Darwinist. The play did not create the stereotype, but it presents it in the form of a powerful story that sticks in the minds of journalists, scientists, and intellectuals generally. If you speak about the teaching of evolution at a public hearing, audience and reporters will be placing your words in the context of Inherit the Wind. Whether you know it or not, you are playing a role in a play. The question is, which role in the story will be yours? And just so those of you who haven't been to public school understand what an impact this movie makes, as a junior high student, I was shown the movie Inherit the Wind in my public school setting, and it strongly affected my views on creation versus evolution. The next section is called The Story of the Play. This is giving you an overview of the movie itself. A handsome young science teacher named Bert Cates, dedicated to his students and his teaching, is jailed for violating a state law against the teaching of evolution. Bert is in love with Rachel Brown, also a teacher and the daughter of the Reverend Jeremiah Brown, the most powerful of the local ministers. Reverend Brown is a vivacious bigot with no redeeming qualities whatsoever, whose practice of Christian ministry seems to be limited to cursing people like Bert and threatening them with damnation. Rachel herself is a conformist. Although she adores Bert, she continually urges him to stop making trouble for himself by speaking out against the community's religious prejudices. The trial of Bert Cates becomes America's first media circus when Matthew Harrison Brady volunteers to be the prosecutor. Brady, a former presidential candidate, has become an anti-evolution crusader in his declining years. And he's kind of a famous person. As the town of Hillsborough is preparing to give Brady a hero's welcome, journalist E.K. Hornbeck arrives from Baltimore. Hornbeck is a familiar movie character, the hard-boiled reporter who makes sarcastic comments about events on stage, a bit like the chorus in an ancient Greek drama. The townspeople provide him with many opportunities to exercise his wit, as they display their ignorance and vulgarity while mindlessly singing choruses of "Give Me That Old-Time Religion." Brady eventually arrives, making a phony-sounding speech, eats picnic food like the glutton he is, and generally shows himself to be a pompous old fool. He is also sneaky. After meeting the Reverend Brown and learning that Rachel Brown is friendly with Bert Cates, he induces the gullible Rachel to confide in him about ideas Bert has shared with her in confidence. Brady treacherously intends to use those against Bert in court, and even to call Rachel as a prosecution witness against her future husband. The Brady welcoming banquet is interrupted by the news that the famous Henry Drummond is coming to be the defense lawyer. Drummond is another familiar movie character, the fearless advocate who fights for justice against seemingly hopeless odds. As the trial begins, we see him trying to counter the religious prejudice of the community and the court. His every witticism strikes home, just as every feeble attempt by Brady to score a point backfires. If the deck in Hillsborough is stacked heavily against Drummond, the deck in Hollywood is stacked just as heavily in his favor. This black and white morality play could not be starker. All intelligence and goodness are on the side of Drummond and Cates and evolution. All folly and malice belong to Brady and Brown and creationists. Although the defense is pure in mind and heart, it has an impossible legal position. Bert admits that he taught evolution, and that is what the law forbids. The prosecution proves its case by making some reluctant students testify that they were taught evolution. Brady unnecessarily supplements this evidence by forcing Rachel to testify to Bert's dangerous opinions, of which the most dangerous is this: God created man in his own image, and man, being a gentleman, returned the compliment. Rachel's testimony has no legal significance, but its dramatic purpose is to underscore Bert's kindness and decency. He forgives Rachel and puts himself at risk by forbidding Drummond to upset her with cross-examination. Drummond has brought several scientific and theological experts to Hillsborough to testify that Darwinism is scientifically valid and no danger to a properly rational religion. Right there, do you notice how they're committing the third mistake from Emilio's letter? And they are separating religion and faith from science and saying that keep your religion, it has nothing to do with evolution, and leave science to the experts here. The judge rules the expert testimony inadmissible, thus leaving the defense temporarily at a loss. Drummond brilliantly saves the situation by calling his adversary Brady to the witness stand as an expert on the Bible. The judge correctly points out that this testimony is also irrelevant to the question whether Bert violated the law. But Brady is so conceited that he insists on taking the stand to show he can defeat the unbeliever. Drummond skillfully takes advantage of Brady's overconfidence. After some preliminary sparring about details like Jonah and the whale, Drummond stuns Brady by pointing out the biblical patriarchs did their begetting by sexual intercourse. Apparently, Brady had not previously thought of this embarrassing but undeniable fact, and he blurts out that the Bible calls sex original sin. The dramatic point, of course, is that Bible believers are killjoys and prudes who want to abolish sex. Eventually, a rattled Brady concedes that since the first day of creation occurred before the sun existed, it might have been longer than 24 hours. Drummond seizes on this concession to demolish Brady's confidence and gets Brady to talk such obvious nonsense that even his supporters laugh at him. The day ends in a spectacular moral victory for the defense, the evolutionists. None of this has anything to do with the legal issue, so the jury returns a guilty verdict the next day anyway. The town fathers are sufficiently embarrassed by the fiasco, however, that they pressure the judge to impose a nominal fine in the hope that this will all end the publicity. Bert refuses to pay the fine and vows to go on speaking up for truth and freedom. Brady desperately attempts to retrieve the situation with another speech and is so upset by his own incoherent rant that he has a stroke and dies on the spot. Rachel tells Bert that she has decided to start thinking for herself, which in the context of the play seems to mean that she will accept Bert's way of thinking instead of her father's. Is she really thinking for herself? I can't help wondering whether her new independence of mind will have unexpected consequences and whether Bert will ever have any second thoughts about having encouraged it. The two lovers decide to leave town and get married. Love and reason thus overcomes prejudice and bigotry. As the play ends, Drummond is left alone on the stage courtroom with his reflections. According to the stage directions, he picks up a copy of Darwin's Origin of Species and a copy of the Bible. Balancing them thoughtfully as if his hands were scales, he half smiles, half shrugs, then he jams the two books together into his briefcase. This symbolism tells us that the Bible and Darwin can balance each other out if we allow Henry Drummond to do the balancing. This is exactly what people try to do when they say that God used evolution to create the world. It is roughly the line of reasoning that we saw Emilio accepting at the beginning of the previous chapter. As you can probably tell from reading this section, this movie is a riot. It is a crack up. It is so overly theatrically done. I really recommend you watch it. It's corny and cheesy, but at the bottom of it, it does represent stereotypes about Christians and evolutionists. And I think it would be very wise of you to understand how the world can view creationists. Now, the next section, go ahead and highlight this next title, The Scopes Trial, What Really Happened. Highlight it green. This is another section of the book. So we're just going to give a brief summary here of the actual trial that this movie is based on and some of the real facts, although it's not super important. As the authors of Inherit the Wind admit in their preface, the play is not history. That is an understatement. The real Scopes trial was not a serious criminal prosecution, but a symbolic confrontation engineered to put the town of Dayton, Tennessee on the map. The Tennessee legislature had funded a new science education program, and to reassure the public that science would not be used to discredit religion, had included as a symbolic measure a clause forbidding the teaching of evolution. The governor who signed the bill, realizing that any prosecution would be an embarrassment, predicted that the law would not be enforced. The American Civil Liberties Union wanted a test case, however, and advertised for a teacher willing to be a nominal defendant in a staged prosecution. So they're paying a teacher to teach evolution so that they can have an attorney prosecute him, okay? The teacher who's being prosecuted is in on the scheme. Local boosters in Dayton took up the offer in the hope that the mock trial would be good for business. The volunteer defendant, John T. Scopes, was a physical education teacher who taught biology briefly as a substitute. He was never in danger of going to jail. Local prosecutors fell in with the scheme and obligingly obtained an indictment against Scopes, respectfully declining the ACLU's offer to pay the cost of the prosecution. The trial got out of hand and became a media circus when William Jennings Bryan volunteered to speak for the prosecution and ClarenceDaro volunteered to be the defense lawyer. So now, unexpectedly, you have two very hotshot attorneys getting involved, kind of for the fun of it. Darrow, fresh from a sensational murder trial in Chicago, was also nationally famous as an agnostic lecturer. Remember, agnostic means someone who believes that there possibly is a God, but doesn't believe you can actually determine the truth and leaves it as an unknown question. Bryan, a 3-time Democratic presidential candidate, was no reactionary, but a progressive politician who had led political battles to protect working people and farmers from the excesses of big business. His reasons for opposing Darwinism appealed to many liberals and socialists in his day, as they still would. Bryan had seen Darwinism used in America to justify unrestrained capitalism, and in Germany to justify the brutal militarism that led to World War I. You might just highlight that last sentence there, starting with Bryan. I think that was good information for you to remember some of the long-term effects of removing God from the equation is a lack of restraint, a lack of order. Like Bryan, ClarenceDaro was a friend of labor unions and an opponent of unrestricted capitalism. He was also a materialist and a determinist who defended his clients by denying that they possessed free will. Darrow did not want to balance the Bible with evolutionary science. He wanted to get rid of religion and replace it with science and agnostic philosophy. That's what we've been talking about this whole time, that this really isn't a battle of can we merge evolution with the Bible. The idea of evolution, the heart and soul behind it, is eliminating God from the discussion. On the other hand, Bryan truly was a scientific ignoramus, and the wily Darrow really did make a fool of him. If Darrow had wanted, he probably could just as easily have made the leading evolutionary scientist of the day look foolish. He's that logical. He could make anyone look like a fool. For example, some of these scientists confidently cited the fraudulent Piltdown man and the Tooth of Nebraska man, which turned out to be from a kind of pig. Both of those were items that had been found that they had thought at the time were proofs of evolution and later had been found were not. Many of the scientists would quote those as proof of human evolution. So what they're trying to point out there is that the evolution scientists make as many errors as William Jennings Bryan, who spoke for the prosecution. If Bryan was confused about the evidence for evolution, he had a lot of respectable company. Everybody is confused about evolution, and that's something that Dr. Johnson talks about over and over in this book, that even the evolutionists don't understand it, and they're being told to present it in a way, but they can't answer questions against it if they're to have a discussion. So those are the facts. That's the facts of the movie. That's the facts of the actual case. The movie ends up becoming more important than the actual case because the movie is what every American in the country has seen. So let's talk about what it means. This next section, what the play means, go ahead and highlight that green. This is how we're going to apply it, okay? I won't go any further into the discrepancies between the play and history because the play has had so much impact that its story is more important than what really happened. The play is not primarily about a single event. It is about the modernist understanding of freedom. Once upon a time, the story says, so Dr. Johnson's going to retell this now. The world was ruled by cruel religious oppressors called Christians, similar to the wicked stepmother and stepsisters in Cinderella, who tried to prevent people from thinking and from marrying their true love. Liberation from this oppression came via Darwin, who taught us that our real creator was a natural process that leaves human reason free to make up new rules whenever we want. Most modernist intellectuals interpret the story that way, and of course, a liberated Cinderella is not likely to give the wicked stepmother another chance to enslave her. Whatever the stepmother says, Cinderella knows who she is and what she wants to do. That is the story the underlying message that Inherit the Wind is getting across to those who watch it. Read this way, Inherit the Wind is a bitter attack upon Christianity, or at least the conservative Christianity that considers the Bible to be, in some sense, a reliable historical document. The rationalists have all the good lines and all the virtues. Brady and Brown are a combination of folly, pride, and malice, and their followers are so many mindless puppets. One would suppose from the play that Christianity has no program other than to teach hatred. At the surface level, the play is a smear, although it smears an acceptable target and hence is considered suitable for use in public schools. Now, I want to tell you, remember, I saw this in junior high. 7th grade, I believe, it was shown to our entire student body. How do you think that is affecting an entire generation? If an entire generation of students are watching this movie in school, do you think that has any impact upon their view of the discussion? That would be a great conversation to have with your parents and your director. Just how ugly the smear is came home to me the first time I saw the movie in a theater next to Harvard University, at a time when I would have called myself an agnostic. The demonstrative student audience freely jeered at the rubies of Hillsborough, whooped with delight at every wisecrack from Hornbeck or Drummond, and reveled in Brady's humiliation. It occurred to me that the Harvard students were reacting much like the worst of the Hillsborough citizens in the movie, being lewd and crude and rioting. Now they're acting like the little-minded Christians in the small town. These Harvard students thought they were showing how smart they were by aping the prejudices of their teachers and by being cruel to the ghost of William Jennings Bryan, who was probably a much better man than any of them. Maybe Hillsborough isn't just Dayton, Tennessee. Maybe sometimes it's Harvard or Berkeley. Now, Berkeley is the university that Dr. Johnson taught at. He was a college professor. The next section is the story told another way. In this section, Dr. Johnson's going to tell this as an allegory, okay? That memory has stayed with me and shows that there may be more than one way to interpret the play. I've told the bare bones of the story literally. Now, let me retell the story at a different level with just a tad of artistic license. A brilliant young teacher develops a following because he has exciting ideas that open up a new way of life. His friends and students love him, but the ruling leaders of the community hate the very thought of him. These elders are themselves cruel hypocrites who pile up burdens on the people and do not lift a finger to help them. The elders rule the people by fear and are themselves ruled by fear. They substitute dogmas and empty rituals for the true teaching they once knew, which commands truth and love as its first principles. The elders want to destroy the teacher who threatens their control over the people, but his behavior and character are so exemplary that they can find no fault to justify condemning him. They plan to entrap him by convincing one of his closest friends to betray him. Eventually, they are able to arrange a rigged legal proceeding and get a guilty verdict. Their victory is empty, however. The teacher wins even when he apparently loses. And he sums up his teaching in these words: "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Does that story sound familiar? Yeah, that is a retelling of the Inherit the Wind trial. It's also a retelling of the story of Jesus Christ, and probably a retelling of a dozen other stories, because all stories are mimicking one another. Of course, Bert Cates is not Jesus, although the play does portray him as virtuously sinless. That it would be more accurate to say that the authors aim to give Cates and Drummond the virtues of Cinderella and Socrates. My point is that even the most seemingly anti-biblical of dramas achieves its moral effect by borrowing elements from the gospel. So even the movie makers, when making Inherit the Wind and wanting Christians to sound ridiculous, use the story and the outline of Jesus Christ in order to prove their point. Which is the good news of how we can be delivered from the power of sin. Sin has power over us in many ways, and one of them is through the mind control practiced by fearful and hypocritical religious authorities. The independent mind that overthrows such oppressive power is good news for everyone but the oppressor. Inherit the Wind is therefore probably truer than its authors knew. There is nothing wrong with its basic story of liberation. That story itself becomes a vehicle of oppression, however, when it invites the people with power to cast themselves as the liberators. It's like the dictators of the former Soviet Union calling themselves the champions of the poor working man. Whatever may have been the case a long time ago, by the time the movie was made, Bert Cates and Henry Drummond were the ones with the power to shut other people up. Okay. That ends the first half of this chapter. So far, we've defined how the world views us. The actual movie, the actual case, and then kind of the storyline message underneath it that people are picking up on. For the rest of this chapter, we're going to talk about how does this apply in our real life now? What parts of the movie are still playing out, and what do we need to be aware of? So this next section is called Owning the Microscope. And you definitely ought to underline that or highlight that green because there's a lot of good information, and we're going to be using this concept of the microphone throughout the rest of the book. My summary of Inherit the Wind left out two events that I now want to bring into the picture. When Henry Drummond is humiliating Matthew Harrison Brady on the witness stand, he accuses Brady of setting himself up as God by presuming to suppress freedom of thought in others. Drummond warns Brady that someday the power may be in other hands, saying, suppose Mr. Cates had enough influence and lung power to rail through the state legislature a law that only Darwin should be taught in the schools. That possibility may have seemed remote in Hillsborough, but of course it is exactly what happened later. That's the boat we're in today. The real story of the Scopes trial is that the stereotype it promoted helped the Darwinists capture the power of the law, and they have since used the law to prevent other people from thinking independently. By labeling any fundamental dissent from Darwinism as religion, they are able to ban criticism of the official evolution story from public education far more effectively than the teaching of evolution was banned from Tennessee schools in the 1920s. But how was this reversal accomplished in a voting democracy? Given that a majority of Americans still believe that God is our creator, how have the Darwinists been able to obtain so much influence and lung power? The play answers that question too. In the final scene of Inherit the Wind, when the jury returns to the courtroom to deliver its verdict, a character identified as Radio Man appears in the courtroom carrying a large microphone. He explains to the judge that the microphone is connected by direct wire to station WGN in Chicago. Radio Man proceeds to report directly to the public on the proceedings as they happen. So, for those of you who haven't seen the movie, it's not like he's videotaping and people can see for themselves what's happening. He has a microphone that is being broadcast over the radio. What's happening in the courtroom, he decides how to report it into the microphone. So what's happening in the courtroom isn't what they're hearing over the mic. What they're hearing over the mic is only what Radio Man is telling them. Brady, famed for decades as an orator with a huge voice, attempts to speak into the microphone but can't master the technique. During Brady's final tirade, the radio program director decides that his speech has become boring, and Radio Man breaks in to announce that the station will return to the Chicago studio for some music. The stage directions describe this as Brady's final indignity, and it brings on his fatal stroke. The microphone, that is, the news media, can nullify Brady's power by, in effect, out-shouting him. When they take that microphone away from him, now they're controlling what everyone hears. But does this development imply liberation or a new form of control that will be more oppressive than the old one? You ought to highlight that question green. That would be a great question to discuss with your parents, especially since we are post-COVID. A lot of people have opinions about news channels and different channels' takes on reporting news and whether it's the truth or not. And so that'd be a really great discussion to have. There is only one microphone in that courtroom, and whoever decides when to turn it on or off controls what the world will learn about the trial. That is why what happened in the real-life Scope trial hardly matters. The writers and producers of Inherit the Wind owned the microphone because they were able to show their version on theaters all across the nation. And now it's on DVD for everyone to see in the whole world, making their interpretation far more important than the reality. Bert Cates didn't have enough lung power to make law in Hillsborough, but his successors had enough microphone power to take over the law at the national level. When the creation-evolution conflict is replayed in our own media-dominated times, the microphone owners of the media get to decide who plays the heroes and who will play the villains. What this has meant for decades is that Darwinists, who are now the legal and political power holders, nonetheless appear before the microphone as Bert Cates or Henry Drummond. The defenders of creation are assigned the role of Brady or of the despicable Reverend Brown. No matter what happens in the real courtroom or the real schoolroom, the microphones keep telling the same old story. This has very practical consequences. I have found it practically impossible, for example, to get newspapers to acknowledge that there is scientific problems with Darwinism that are quite independent of what anybody thinks about the Bible. A reporter may seem to get the point during an interview, but after the story goes to the editors, it almost always comes back with the same formula. Creationists are trying to substitute Genesis for the science textbook. Scientific journals follow the same practice, that Matthew, Harris, and Brady may have valid scientific points to make just isn't in the script. So that is how the microphone has been turned around, and that is who owns the microphone today. Although with social media, there's a lot of different microphones going on, which may also be why you find so many times on social media things are cut or banned or restricted, because people are trying to control the microphone. The next section is called Danny Phillips. This is a real live example of what Dr. Johnson just explained to you happens. Occasionally, a dissenter from Darwinian threatens to take over the role of Bert Cates. Here is one example. Danny Phillips was a 15-year-old high school junior in the Denver area who thought for himself. His class was assigned to watch a NOVA program produced with government funds for National Public Television, which stated the usual evolutionary story as fact. Its story went something like this. The first organized form of primitive life was a tiny protozoan. From these one-celled organisms evolved all life on Earth. Science education today encourages students to memorize that sort of naturalistic doctrine and repeat it on a test as fact. Because Danny has a special interest in truth, however, and because his father is pastor of a church that has an interest in questioning evolutionary naturalism, Danny knew that this claim of molecule-to-man evolution goes far beyond the scientific evidence. So he wrote a lengthy paper criticizing the NOVA program as propaganda. School administrators at first agreed that Danny had a point, and they tentatively decided to withdraw the NOVA program from the curriculum. That set off a media firestorm. Of course, Danny was making a reasonable point. The doctrine that some known process of evolution turned a protozoan into a human is a philosophical assumption. Remember, we don't have any proof to back that up. The scientific ways to prove things through observation or experimentation, we have never been able to do on evolution. No one has observed evolution, and no one has been able to reproduce it in an experiment. So you have to take evolution on faith, just like you take creation. Not something that can be confirmed by experiment or by historical studies of the fossil record. But the fact that administrators seriously considered any dissent from evolutionary naturalism infuriated the Darwinists, who flooded the city's newspapers with their letters. Some of the letters were so venomous that the editorial page editor of the Denver Post admitted that her liberal faith had been shaken. She wrote that these defenders of intellectual freedom behaved, in fact, just like a bunch of conservative Christians. Well, imagine that. There was a different kind of fundamentalism, but no less dogmatic and no less intolerant. In other words, at least one editor wasn't sure who was playing what role in this revival of Inherit the Wind. When Danny's story appeared on CBS television a little later, however, an experienced Darwinian debater named Eugene Scott was careful to cast Danny as the opponent of learning. She argued, if Danny Phillips doesn't want to learn evolution, that's his own business. But his views should not prevail for 80,000 students who need to learn evolution to be educated. When evolution is the subject, questioning whether the official story is true is enough to make you an enemy of education. I think you might want to highlight that last sentence in yellow. That is something you're going to find over and over again. This manufactured image of a high school junior censoring science education replaced the real Danny Phillips on national television, just as Inherit the Wind replaced the real Scopes trial. What Danny said when he got a chance to speak for himself was reported only in a local paper. Nobody else told it. He said, students' minds are to be kept open and not limited by a set of beliefs. That is exactly the right line to take. And Danny had for a moment a partial success in getting past the microphone owners. The CBS network and the Denver School Board decided against Danny in the end, but then the Hillsborough jury also decided against Bert Cates. All they inherited was the wind. This is the final section, an uphill battle. So we've talked about one example of where this has happened, although there's dozens and dozens more. But this is a nice little summary for the end of this chapter, explaining you just need to really understand the battle that you're facing, how people view creationists, and so you have to overcome that. In subsequent chapters, I'll be explaining how some of us are working to make it possible for evolution to be treated like other issues, where criticism of the official story can get a fair hearing. It is an uphill battle because Darwinists can use their control of the microphone to cast their opponents as religious dogmatists, regardless of what the opponents are actually saying. If critics object to the teaching of philosophical doctrines as scientific facts, the microphones say that they are trying to prevent students from learning. If critics attempt to tell the other side of the story and bring out evidence that the textbooks ignore, they are accused of trying to insert religion into the science curriculum in violation of the Constitution. The rule of the microphone is heads we win, tails you lose. So, it isn't easy to win a game played by those rules, but there is a way to do it. The first step is to learn how to detect baloney, which we are going to learn about next week in chapter 3. So just remember, those who speak the loudest, the longest are often believed. And if microphone man gets heard by the most people because he's the loudest, people are often going to believe it. And sometimes it doesn't matter what the truth is, what is actually stated in person. The person relaying the message, such as the media, is the one that gets to define what's heard. So that wraps up chapter 2. I do hope you watch the movie. It's a riot. It is so funny to see, and I think you'll enjoy seeing. One of the funny things now is that the movie is almost reversed because evolution is the only thing that's allowed to be taught in schools. Somebody's stepping out and saying, hey, let's think logically here. Evolution doesn't actually make any sense. They are the ones who are under prosecution now. All right, I hope this helps with your homework. Have a great week.